So this morning, we're gonna we're gonna work on like I'm not sure if you guys did much else at home with white dots. I didn't do anything between classes here. Like I want to make sure I'm just kind of demonstrating everything that we're doing in class. But so last week I did a little bit of work on some white lines, rays coming out from the eyes. We did a little bit of preliminary work creating some dark shadows, like some of these dark areas in the base of the eye. And I did some of the little light flecks here. What we're going to be doing basically to start with today, the most significant thing we're going to do is just some of the white markings on the back, on the wings, and on the head. Like we're essentially just going to take some of the white markings like in and around the eyebrow, the face, some of the little white flecks on the back of the head, and on the back of the like down in here, some of these little white flecks on the back. There's some white marks on the back of the head. Like this is one of the things that saw whet owls have that they're known for is what they call a kind of a false face on the back. Like they have these little marks on the back that usually there's a couple of little white marks on either side that at quick glance, I'm not sure if you can see this one. You probably can't see that one, but right up in here, this one kind of shows it fairly well. On the back of the head, you've got two light marks and a center mark, which just kind of gives like in the world these guys living in the bush and dusk and so forth, quite often that just gives them a quick little look of you know, it's a face, if you will, at quick glance. There's a little face on the back, two eyes and they do vary a little bit. We're looking at all the different 28 different owls that I was able to handle, and they all had some kind of a marking on the back, like a face, but some of them were more pronounced than others. They're quite a bit of variation on them. And on the back, like I said, on this part of it here, there we go. On this part, like down in here, we want to emulate all those with the little bands on the tail, this kind of stuff. We want to make sure that you can see how those bands work. And yeah, I've kind of noticed on a lot, it seems like there's typically around 3 rows of bands on most of them, but like you can't see the upper band on this one. There's a little bit at the tip, two in the middle and up in here. And I've got others that like this is a little guy that I pointed out last week that see there's one little band on the tail and he doesn't have any of the markings on the cape or like he's if you wanted to paint one like that you could. It's a little easier. You don't have all the white dots to put on it. But so look at these photographs. You got different views. Just keep looking at the different photographs. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be putting in these markings using I'm going to use warm white for this, and we're going to be mixing up a wash of warm white. So just take this warm white, just basically like we've done in the past. I'm going to mix up a fair amount so that you guys can just snag some off this palette rather than mixing up your own, but I'm going to mix up quite a bit here this morning. Get the paint. A couple of drops of flow medium is usually adequate. And then we want, in mixing up this wash, I probably want at least as much water as I have paint. Ideally, probably a little bit more because we're still at a point when we put this down. I don't want this to be a really stark white marks that I put on. And the way that I control that is this is just a reminder, the way I control how intense that white mark is when I put it down is if I use a fairly diluted wash of white, when I put that down on my bird, it might look quite white when I lay it down initially, but I know from experience that as that paint dries, it becomes more transparent. And then it doesn't look like a really stark white blob that you've put on there. So this is kind of consistency of, I don't know, maybe whole milk might be a good way to describe it. Not 2% milk, not cream, but kind of a whole milk consistency. And so I've mixed that up so that it's
2% milk is too thin.
what's that?
2% is too thin.
Yeah. 2% is too thin. Cream is too thick. You know, you play around with it until you get what you want. And like when you put some of these first dots down, um, when you lay some of the first dots down, when they dry, if they're not white enough, then add a little bit more pigment to your mix, just a tiny little bit. Most of the time, they're not going to be like you're still mostly putting these down to create locations or like to locate things. You're not trying to do a finished, you're not trying to make them look finished at this point. So I'm going to I'm just going to clean off my palette knife. When you're taking this stuff and putting it on your own palette, you can use the palette knife or use your brush, whatever you want. I'm going to take my brush. I'm going to use, what I'm going to do, I'm going to start by putting in some of these marks here. These little marks along the back. I'm going to do some of those first thing. I think I've got another photograph here that shows them quite well. Like this photograph shows the way they are. There's a few of them up in here. They sort of form a bit of a row. They're a little row-like along the outer edge of the main cover. It's on the wing. These are a couple of pretty good photographs showing them here and here. Also, I think this is, in my opinion, this is kind of overdone. The way Floyd did these on the back, they look really, really good, but I don't see that kind of a dynamic when I look at the Saw Whet Owls. I don't see the outer margin being all white. I just see little, almost like the dots on the back of a loon. You know, they don't cover the whole feather. So I'm going to wet my brush, as I always do, dip it in the water, pick up some of this white, make sure it's, you know, well mixed in here, but pick up some of the white, dab it out on a paper towel, just so that my brush isn't dripping wet. So I've dabbed it on the paper towel. And now what I want to do is I want to take the outer part of this brush is a nice roundish shape so that I can hopefully recreate some of these other textures. I got to put my optivisor on. You can't see this on the video, but it's kind of important to me. So you determine at the outer edge of these back feathers here, you determine that you want a few. So you lay your brush down and pull it up, and you can make them quite row-like so that they overlap a little bit. Kind of come back on the same side. You could lay your brush flat and it makes a fairly rounded margin like this, you know, fairly square edge margin. But if you lay it on its side a little bit and pull it back, it makes a dot that's not quite as sharp. So you just kind of play around with until you get what you want. And the thing is with these is if you want them whiter, you just go over them again. And then, you know, I've got a few more I can just kind of locate in here. I'm going to put one up in there, another one coming down in here. The other thing is if you end up, like I've gone over this, once it's dry, it might look a little whiter than I want it to look. I can just take a little tiny wash of umber and just wash over that, tone it down. I'm not trying to erase it. I'm just trying to tone it down. So I'm wetting my brush again, dabbing it out on the paper towel so that it's fairly dry. In this case, I'm thinking I may not even have enough material there. So you put a few of these little subtle marks in. And you can see on the back here how they they're somewhat random. Some of them are a little lighter and some of them are a little darker. I set a few of them in there just to get my location of them. And then I do the same thing on the back. If I look at the back of the head here, I want to create some little almost V-shaped dot type thing in the middle and then a couple more on the outside. So just for location, this will be kind of in the middle. And then the outer eye pieces, the things that'll kind of form the outer eyes, I can just kind of few dots like that. So now what I've done is I've kind of created, the location of these various dots. And we're going to be spending the time this morning. Once we've got them in location, we're going to be spending time refining them. And we won't all be using this big brush for everything. We'll be using the big brush and the small brush. But I thought to set in their location, we'll start with this bigger brush. And then you do as much as you can. You can even use the side of the big brush if you want, like for, just for a few finer, more distinct details. There's nothing, there's no real hard and fast one way of doing this. You can use the side of the brush or the edge of the brush. And you just keep working at that. You see now, like these ones along this side already have, because I went over them a couple of times, already have a bit of a transparent look to them. I'm going to go over, mix up some of my paint here, dab out my brush again. I don't want the brush really, really wet, but I do want some paint in it so that when I lay this down, and keep in mind, it's not essential that I go over absolutely every thing that I did before. I just maybe want to do a couple little edges. Slight random look is usually advantageous. So see, after a couple of applications, it's starting to look a little more transparent. And while it looks like there's some transparency and there's some lighter edges. And those are the broad strokes. So I can do the same thing even here on the tail. I can take, because this is a wider brush now. I did last week, I did with the fine brush, I did a few dots to kind of indicate where the row is going to be. Now with a brush that doesn't have a lot of paint in it, I can just come along here and widen out those, kind of widen out or soften out some of those bands. And this is very forgiving, because if you do kind of make a bit of a mess of things, you got too much paint in your brush. See how that's looking so much softer just by taking the edge of this and just adding a little bit of paint in there. And if you do overdo it and it doesn't look very good, just flow a wash, let it dry, flow a wash of burnt umber over top of it. Again, kind of a semi-blotchy wash of burnt umber. But see, that looks a lot different than what I started with. It looks a lot softer. And essentially, you're looking at your reference material. Anywhere that you see some white markings or white dots on the bird, which includes things like on the face. And I'm using warm white. Yeah. And again, just sop up a pretty good amount of it with your brush, dab out your brush on a paper towel until it's not dry, but there's absolutely no excess paint in it. Like it's dabbed out. And then any of the areas that you want to lighten up or make whiter, and around the face on ours right now, we probably got to darken it up more than anything else. So there's probably not a lot of white that we need to do. But if you do see anything that you want to lighten up, like when I look around, I don't really see a whole lot that I need to do on this one. You could actually, come in here and just do a few. You don't really see much of them, but you start with a little bit of paint here and you drag a little bit of white into your brown marks, on the edge here. It's always the painting on stuff like this to make it look soft and subtle is always what I call a back and forth technique. Like, I can put a little bit of this white, pick up a little bit of white. I can put a little bit of this white in here and draw some of it up into the brown that I've got. I know that there's paint on my brush. Like if I put this down here, you see that it does put paint down. Like it's adding paint. So when I put this down here, I know that there's white paint hitting the surface. And if I draw a little bit of it up into the brown that I've got, any areas that you've got that you want to lighten up or soften up, you can just take some of this and pull some of this white into it, and that'll soften up the edge on it. Subtlety is the key with this paint. If you can paint soft, that's really important. And a lot of times people they have too much paint in their brush. There's just too much going on. So we'll just kind of do what you can with warm white. Some of these dots in here, you may want to, like I know on the head on mine, when I look at some of these photographs here, I see there's some white streaks and dots, like especially towards the back on the outer edge of the facial disc. We put these little white dots along the facial disc here. But if you look down and there's a little triangular area behind the facial disc down in here, that there's actually some little white streaks in there. So I'm going to use the edge of I'll dab out my brush and I'll use the edge of my brush to just throw in a few streaks. And these streaks aren't necessarily straight lines. Like they're sort of like we put these in, you've got a little bit of a jaggedy thing happening there. So you want them looking a little bit random. They go on this side, it's kind of a triangular area that you don't paint these streaks in a straight line. If you just put stripes down there and put a straight line in, it really wouldn't look very good. But you notice I'm using the brush sideways to make these marks a little bit narrower, thinner. And I can go over to some of the same area, go over it twice. I want them streak-like, but I don't want them to be really apparent, obvious stripes. Because if you see in here, they do have a little bit of a streakiness to them, but they're not really super well defined. And then, other like this, got that in other areas, these little dots get a little thinner. So what we're going to do to start with, though, we'll get into these other dots when it comes time to change over to your fine brush here later on. But we'll do what we can with this heavier brush right now, the cat's tongue, and get some of those other lines in. Get them located, get them started. With many of you, we'll probably end up with a light wash of burnt umber over everything again, just to soften things up and then come back and refine. It's always that back and forth, back and forth. You never get it looking perfect first time out, but it's mostly about locating where they are, and you can refine them later. So we can get going on that. That's basically what we're going to do to start with. And then I think most of the rest of this is going to be kind of refining things. We'll do a little work on darkening some feather edges, and got quite a bit of work to do on the facial disc, obviously, before we're done. So you grab some of this unbleached or this warm white. If you were working on at home, you could use unbleached titanium for this as well. It would work quite well. But I wouldn't use titanium white for it. So I'm going to continue using the same paint. I'm just switching gears and I'm going to go with a finer brush and kind of wet the brush, uh, dab it out, and then I'm going to pick up some of this titanium or this warm white. Sorry. Pick up some of the warm white, dab out my brush so that it's not dripping wet. I don't want a big puddle of paint in my brush. But what I do want when I paint here is I want there to be a noticeable amount of paint to come through. So this is where we spend quite a bit of time actually on this little step for defining and really lightening up some various portions of each feather. Anywhere that you want it to look a lot whiter, you just go over top of what you've done so you can see how that changes you got to wait for it to dry to really fully assess what's happening here. I'm going to take on mine, just taking this paint stick off, mainly just because it's in the way to get the bird in the camera. You know, normally if I was painting, I'd leave the paint stick in. I'd rather not handle the bird itself any more than I have to. But so you can see, moving a little closer here, you can see that I just make a few little marks to define the edges of these things. Kind of makes them a little more legitimate when you do that. Like they start to look more deliberate. Like when they're just smudges, they still look kind of cool, but you want them to have some definition to them. And you're not going to get that done after just one application of paint. Like you don't want your brush to be too loaded up, otherwise it just makes a great big blob. If you did make a great big blob, if your brush was too loaded and you did make a great big blob, just dab your brush out and try to lift off as much as you can. Let it dry. Like you don't want to let it dry in a great big blob, but lift off as much as you can. Let it dry. Flow a little bit of a wash of burnt umber over it to tone it back a little bit, and then try again. You've always got the option of coming back in and a light wash, and that'll soften things up quite a bit. Now, keep in mind, anywhere that if you put a line like this in over top of something that's already got a bit of white paint on it, it's going to look a lot lighter. But if you come back and if you come in and put a little mark in here where you don't have any paint, that will become more transparent as it dries. So you can keep putting in little detail like this. And what I would suggest very strongly, when you're painting, when you're doing this kind of a step, is don't get hypnotized by the process where you just keep on repeatedly going over things. Stop every once in a while and have a look at it and assess what you've got and look and go, oh, I'd like a little bit more happening in here. I'd like to lighten up this. I think it would look really good if I just had a couple little dots in here. And look at your photographs, look at your carving, and just look at little features that you see and say, I like what I see here, the kind of the transparency, and try to imagine how would I paint just that little bit of a tip there, because they're not all the same. They're not all the same density. And that's the danger that you're going to get into when you're painting something like this, is if you just kind of get into repetitive mode where you kind of go over and paint the same 27 feathers, paint them all exactly the same at the end. It doesn't look soft and random like the real bird does. So you can already see the difference between where I started here, which is just smudgy, and some of this more definition. I'll pick up a little more paint, dab out my brush, really important. And then each time I add more of this white in, I probably do just a smaller area. I'm not trying to go over what I did before. I'm just trying to highlight certain features on the feather. I guess you do have to be careful. Like I wasn't really thinking about this, but I almost like I had my finger resting on the bird here and I had just painted that. So it is possible, depending on how much paint you put down, it's possible you might end up smudging something if you're not careful. But what's that? Yeah, there you go. You got your fingerprint. But even a smudge, can you fingerprint a little smudge? You go, oh, I'll turn that into a feather. Like you don't have to erase it. It's what looks good. What do and the main one that I want to get on these, the main thing that I want to do is this little row and these rows on the outer part of the cape, defining those. So that's where a lot of my attention is going to be because these are the most kind of defined part. And as I paint a little bit more towards the tip and a little less up at the base, they tend to look more, they're whiter at the end. And that's what gives you some of that softness. Again, go back to what I've got just by adding a few little lines in. And you do the same thing with these little streaky lines in here. You can actually create continuity from one blob to the next by just putting a little line down. The real trick with a lot of this stuff is looking at your photographic reference and trying to see what you've got there. If when you're done these marks, if they look too harsh, like they don't look soft enough, what do? A little bit of burnt umber, a little wash, soften them up, and then come back and touch up a few areas with your white. It's pretty rare that you're going to get this looking perfect first time round. You get it, you practice on it here, and then I will be demonstrating this, kind of the wash thing a little bit later when we mix up some burnt umber. But for now, what you're trying to do is just start to refine. Use your little brush here and start to refine the features that you've been painting in here. Like if you want to put a kind of more of a dot in the center of some of these feathers and lighten up the center of it to make these eyes and add a little bit more fine detail in here with these markings on the back here. You can add a few more little fine details. That's part of the reason why you get this little brush. So that's what we're going to be working on. I'm just going to carry on painting this for a little bit. I've done enough demonstration here. I think you guys can go ahead and start working on it. Just basically anywhere that you see a need to adjust or alter your white, like add little dots, um, refine some edges, add finer detail. All of that stuff is just kind of what you kind of poke away at. I just always want to remind myself when I'm painting this, I'm not trying to make this look like a finished piece. There's kind of a little bit row-like. I'm going to bring a little bit more back in here just to kind of make it look a little more row-like. I could come back with my bigger brush if I felt a need to do that. And I'm just putting a few extra little marks and dots back in here. It's again, just trying to look at the overall, on my photograph here, you can see the white marks are more intense and closer together up in here, and then they peter out. There's a little area in the back where there really isn't much of anything. But on this guy, on this other guy here, you can see they're finer and more delicate, and they come back a little further. I think they do anyway. But you can see they're not as dense here as they are on this guy. So these ones get more delicate and spaced out. And then the ones on the front here, this is where you'll take some of them towards the front here and you'll actually thicken them up a little bit. You don't have to do them all, just do some of them. This is where it's important not to have too much paint in your brush, because if you do, you quite often end up just making kind of blobs. And don't be afraid to experiment with painting, like holding the bird so that he's facing you, and painting some of the bases, like from the back of the feather towards the front, and do others from the front of the feather towards the back, just to see what kind of an effect you get. It looks a little different. I'm just touching this to the base of some of these feathers right now, because what I really like is when you get a white mark like this, it's got 2 or 3 or 4 different values in it. Like it's whiter at the base and not as white as you get towards the tip. Sorry? Yes, I am. Right here. While I'm working with my small fine brush and my uh, white here, I can use this to actually create some little, um, cross hatch, some little white streaks into some of these shapes that I've put in here. How well this is going to show up here. Get it to focus. Maybe there. Some of these little light marks that I put in. And I just paint some of those. Kind of breaks things up. They're fine little lines. And I'm just using them to kind of break up the blotchiness, if you will. Just add a little bit of direction and focus to some of these marks. And I can even come in from the bottom and bring I want my brush to be fairly dry, but bring some white like lines up into the, the top here. Bring a few lines in to soften up the transition towards the head. You can see some of those lines that I put in. And if when I'm done with them, I think, oh, I kind of overdid a little bit, easy to fix. I'm just gonna, but I think that probably did pretty good. It just kind of made this look a little bit more natural. And I can use the same brush just to widen up and enhance some of these white lines, these streaks that I put in, just to make them a little more pronounced. Also, if I go over them a few times with a brush that doesn't have a huge amount of paint in it, um, what I end up with is I end up with a kind of a softer looking little streak coming off the eye. And most of the stuff, it's, other than your finest feather detail, most of the time this is all about softness, getting a softer look. So you see those look softer than these little faint lines that I had last week. And I'll just, come back over, and I don't want my brush to be too heavily loaded with paint when I'm doing this. And if I go over it, streak it a few times and widen it out at the end, then they just look softer. And notice how long I've been able to go painting this without having to go back to the palette. When you load your brush up and you're using flow medium in your paint there, so those just look softer now than they did before. When you load your brush up and you're using a little bit of flow medium in the paint, you get quite a bit of paint staying inside the barrel of the brush here, and it works its way out towards the tip and just becomes, that's where the paint wants to go. And the flow medium helps it come out of the brush a little bit better. Getting there. There we go. I'm going to shift gears a little bit here. We've been doing a lot of the white marks and you can keep working on those. It's always a back and forth. You work on the white for a while, you do something else, you come back with the white. You don't have to just, it's not like one step you complete. You might overdo it with the white in a few places, and then you have to come back and um, lighten it up a little bit. So actually, I've just got to go grab some other paint here. So in shifting gears, I'm going to take some burnt umber and I'm going to start um, just defining some of the darker areas. So I'm going to mix up. Here, I'll put this down on the palette. Mix up some burnt umber again. I try to mix up enough so everybody's got some in the class here, and I'm going to use a few drops, a little bit of here it is, a little bit of carbon black. Now I don't have the Joe Sonia carbon black in front of me, but just a little bit of carbon black just to darken it up a little bit. Once I've mixed it up, I can determine if it's dark enough, and I can always add a little bit more black if I want to. But what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to mix up a little darker brown than what we started with. And I don't want it, like if I really wanted to darken things up a lot, I'd just use black, or I'd use something real dark. Keeping in mind that subtlety is a really important part of a successful paint job. I've just added a little bit of black to this. And I know, because I've added black to it, I know that it's going to be darker than what I did before. It's just physics, right? A few drops of flow medium, roughly equal amount of water to what I had for paint. Now, if you look at the photograph that's in front of me, the one directly above this one right here, and the other one over here, you'll notice that the wingtips and primaries are the lightest part of the bird. The tail tends to be darker than any of the other areas. So I want to kind of darken up the value of that tail a little bit. And what I'm going to do that is the way I'm going to do that is to use my small brush here. I'll pick up a little bit of this darker brown now, dab out my brush on the paper towel, and then just come in here and use it to paint the outer edges of each tail feather in between my little white lines that I've done. So I'm, with a thinner, fairly thin wash of paint, I'm just going to paint along the outer edge of each of these feathers. And to start with, if necessary, it can even be a fairly well-defined line. It's ideal if you can make it look a little softer. But so even in doing so with those little fine lines, and I have to come in from the other side here. Yeah, you can see that okay. And if I'm using a brush that doesn't have a huge amount of paint in it, and I'm using a fairly dilute paint, like it's almost like it's a wash basically. If that's what I'm doing, I don't have to worry about the edge looking like a really, really defined sharp line, especially on my first application. So you can see how that's made it look darker, softer compared to, say, where we started. I set them side by side here. I'm not sure if you will see that. Yeah, see, that side looks lighter. This side looks darker. And as we go over the entire surface of the tail, we start by putting dark edges on here. And I'm just going to demonstrate on one side. Dab out the brush a little bit so you're not too heavy. And start off by, by just painting the tips of these feathers. And then once you've done one application, you can start dragging some of that dark brown into the base of the feather a little bit more with some lines. See, by drawing a few little streaks away from that first one that we put in, by bringing a few streaks away from what you do, you soften up that edge so it doesn't look quite as harsh. And it just keeps getting darker and darker. See how that works? It's and just repetitive, keep adding on layers. The other thing that I want to do while I've got this color mixed up is I want to come along and I want to define the outer edges of each of the wing feathers. I just want to basically darken up the edges of them because the feathers themselves are fairly light. Like on yours, you may have gotten them darker in the primaries when you put your base coat on. If you did, still go through this step, and then what we'll do is we'll take a wash of white, maybe with a little bit of burnt umber in it, and go over everything and bring the value down, like lighten it up a little bit. But for starters, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my brush. I've dabbed it off on the paper towel. I want to make sure that it's not too, like there's not too much paint in it. So if I lay it down here, it doesn't really leave a puddle, but I might want to just touch it to the paper towel a little bit more because this technique involves laying the brush down kind of almost flat to the feather and then rubbing the outer edge of it. The real trick here is not to hold your brush up like this. You're holding your brush, laying it almost flat on the carving and go over from the back to the front, lay it down, back to front like that, and you take every feather The other thing that I'd suggest is just lay the brush down, follow the edge of your burning. I'm assuming you'll be able to see the edge of your burning and where these feathers are supposed to be. If you can't, then you just have to, wherever you paint is where the feather edge is going to be. So if when you did this burning, if you've kind of got a bit more of just lines rather than individual feathers showing, it's not a big problem. You just paint where you want the edge of the feather to be. Dab this off on a brush a little bit, lay it down, and so what I'm doing, this is a fairly quick, easy way to darken up the edges of your feathers, but you want it to be a fairly thin wash. And usually I like to go over it a couple of times. So now you can see the edges of those feathers. They've been well defined, but they don't look like black stripes along the edge. They're kind of a softer edge. And that's where this whole thing about laying the brush down on its almost flat on its side and going just in the one direction. When I go from the back towards the front, what happens is, I've found anyway, the texture that you've burned in here actually draws the paint out towards the edge of the feather. If you go backwards, it's going to want to pull the paint into the inside of the feather. So again, just lay your brush down almost flat, draw it from the front of the feather towards the back. And you're not just creating a little stripe down the side of the feather. Most of the paint ends up on the outer edge of the feather. But it kind of blends in towards the base. Do the best you can on each feather. And you can always come back and touch it up later. You see how that's coming into place, and you may have to go back to your palette fairly regularly, but lay the brush flat, work from the front to the back, and don't be afraid to go over it a couple of times. You may want to lift your brush up a little higher just to more define the actual edge. You'll have to change the angle of the brush from this to this as you go, just depending on how much paint you want to get on the edge versus how much paint you want to get up to the, further up into the feather. The further into the feather, the flatter the brush. And the higher you lift the brush, the more it's going to go up just towards the edge of your feather. On this one, I was looking at it going, I'm having a little trouble seeing where I actually burned. So I had to kind of look at it a little closer to make sure that I'm painting it where I want it to be. As I mentioned before, if you were working on a smooth bird and you hadn't burned any feathers in on it, you paint this, and wherever your paint is what the eye is going to fill in to say, okay, that's a feather. But see how much more defined those feathers are. They're starting to look more definite compared to the other side, which is where we started. Just, you can see the texture from the burning, but now you can actually, they're starting to look like actual feathers. And I'm using this to define where the outer edge of all those feathers are. Lay my brush down a little flatter to draw some of that paint up into the base of the feather. We've still got our secret weapon of washes if we ever want to, like we can always do. Again, every single time I lay down a wash, add some more stuff. Like I do that a lot when I'm working on a bird at home. The more washes, the more layers you put on, the more softer and transparent it's going to look. This looks pretty good just the way it is right now. But if we do another layer where I just do a wash of maybe a mix of burnt umber and white, just a little bit of white in the burnt umber just to soften it up a little bit, and then come back on and do this again. That I would probably just do certain areas, and you kind of dry brush the wash in a little bit. That's a way of just doing a little area rather than slopping a wash on. You mix up a wash, dry out your brush, and just go over an area softly to bring the value either lighter or darker, depending on what you want to do. And then here, I'll just take this and define the outer edge on each of these. Laying my brush fairly flat. I do want to leave the middle of these feathers fairly light. Like I want that area to look lighter than the rest of the birds. So again, you can come back if it doesn't look quite light enough. You can come back and dry brush a wash in there and lighten it up just with a little bit of a very thin wash of warm white. that's dry brushed in. You know, that'll just lighten up the value a little bit. Then you adjust it again by using these browns. Now you also, what I can do here is I can also come along with this and put a few little, what I've done initially was I laid the brush down and just defined the outer edge of these feathers. But what I can also do is I can further enhance the look of that by just painting a few little dots and marks. You know, so the edge of the feather actually has a few little, maybe little subtle openings, or, you know, it's not just a stripe come down the side. So it just keeps looking more and more interesting the more layers you put in. And if you see an area that you say, well, that would look a lot better if it was a little darker in that area, just come in and darken it up a little bit. Kind of giving you the idea. And I extend and do the same thing out onto the wingtips. Like I want to have, it's not always photographically accurate to darken up the edge of a wingtip. Like if you look at these wingtips here, they're pretty, they're the wingtips themselves are fairly pale, but I still want to have, like for my part, I still want to have a little bit of definition on these, on the outer edge of these wingtips. So I'll still do the same thing here. It's nice to have that contrast. Now, on some birds, you actually would paint the primaries, the edge of the primaries, you'd paint them with lighter color rather than darker color. And you'd have to determine, depending on the bird that you're doing, you'd have to determine whether you're wanting to lighten or darken the outer margins of these primary feathers of the wingtips. I don't want to really go crazy and overdo it, but I do want to have some definition there on the primaries just to make them stand out a little bit better. And I do the inside the same way. So you see what a difference that makes between, again, where we started, where we end up here. And so all of these feathers on the wing, you end up defining them using this slightly darker burnt umber. You can carry on and, you know, so we did the tail. You can start at the tail, work your way up, or any hopscotch around any direction you want. But anywhere that you want a darker feather margin or darker edge to the feather, and that could even be on some of these ones on the shoulder here, which don't have a lot of, they don't have a lot of white in them. What you want to do is you want to make the feathers look a little more interesting. So you just take some of the edges here. You don't have to do the whole feather. Take some of these edges here and you define the back edge of that feather a little bit, just with some of these dark marks. So I'll let you work on that for a while. I've got quite a bit of this darker umber sitting on my palette. So you see it by just coming in and touching up some of these edges. You can really want to avoid painting stripes around the outside of each of these feathers, but anywhere that you've got these feathers burned in, it can really make a big difference in enhancing the look on the bird, just to create a few little dots here and there on the back edge of some of these feathers. It defines them and just makes that whole area look a lot more interesting. And you do the whole thing, like, you know, where these covert feathers come back over top of the, or where these feathers come back over top of the greater coverts. few little dots, a few little marks, and things look a lot more defined. So we're going to work on that area on the back. See, before it really didn't look like much. It was pretty nondescript. Just it was blotchy, which we wanted. But now once you start defining some of those edges, that blotchiness that was underlying it actually adds, it enhances, makes it look softer and fluffier. If we had a uniform color underneath, it wouldn't look near as full and rich. So we'll work on that for a little bit. That's our main thing. I'm going to just keep recording for a little bit and finish up some of these feathers, and then I'll probably do the other side off camera. But for now, I'll pause right here. So yeah, and the big thing is when you're painting something like this, you're getting into these little areas of softer contour feathers and stuff like that. Wherever you paint is going to determine where that edge of the feather appears to be. So you don't have to see and understand exactly where your original feather texture was burned in. It's very helpful if you can use that. But if you can't see it, if it just looks more hair-like, what you may want to do is go back to your pattern, have a look at the pattern, or have a look at probably better yet, have a look at the photographs of the real bird, and then paint in where you want the back edge of these feather margins to be. And anywhere you paint a dark mark, that's where the back edge of that feather is going to be. You're telling with the paint, you're telling the feather where it's going to be. And certainly if your wood burning is distinct and easy to see and easy to follow, ideally the best thing is to paint what's there, you know, paint the dark edges of these feathers consistent with what you burned. This would be the case with pretty much every feather on the bird. You can paint in a darker margin on that feather. And now you start to see where maybe some of that little bit of blotchiness that we had before, or as unevenness, really starts to, make these feathers in here stand out quite a bit. And you just keep going over and adding more layers and touching up here, touching up there. You can also come back and do the same thing with some of these feathers on the back here. You can define a little, like I wouldn't necessarily, unless you want to get rid of some of where the white is, but I wouldn't necessarily paint this over where the white is, but you'll have a darker, you can create a little bit of a darker margin on the back of some of these feathers. Just to add a few darker values in certain parts of the bird. It starts to create more depth all the way. Let's do some. So I just turned this around. So I'm kind of painting from you know, backwards. I'm starting with my brush at the tip of the feather and pulling the paint into the inside of the feather as opposed to the other way around. Either way works. It's more a matter of you get a slightly different effect. And I would encourage you to try different things when you're working with it. Just try going one direction, try going the other. See which one, if one gives you, a nicer result for what you're trying to accomplish. I'm just going to put a few dots on the back end of this one right now, just kind of so I can define where I want these darker, these darker feathers that are kind of coming over top of some of the wing feathers. You can actually spend quite a bit of time doing this. Generally speaking, if you pause every once in a while to look at it and look for an area that okay, that looks a little bit too like it doesn't look quite right. I need to just darken up that little area down in there and right in here. I just want to just darken them up a little bit so they're not quite as stark. But I want this brighter in here. Like I'm going to keep it like that. I want it. That's desirable for me. Um, keep coming back and haven't really demonstrated the other side of this wing tip feather. Lay it down fairly flat and start at the base of the feather, work towards the tip. I've got an area here that's kind of light along this edge, and in in painting these edges the way I am, if that doesn't darken up the edge enough, I can always just come back and paint some little strokes in there later. Just to kind of break things up a little bit. Now, in this little area in here, this is quite detailed. I'm actually just going to paint a few little dots in that. Come on, focus on me. There we go. I'm just going to paint a few little dots onto the edge of that. And sometimes after you've been working with this paint for a while, you'll find that you may need to add a tiny bit of more water to it. Like the water does, especially here in Saskatchewan in the middle of our winters, the water does evaporate fairly quickly relative, especially if you're painting in the summer. So what you may need to do is you may need to add a little bit more water to your paint. If you find that it's not coming out of your brush as well or blobbing up in your brush or something, that might be time to just dilute the paint a little bit more. Like it just kind of feels to me like I'm probably at a place where I need to add a little bit more water to my paint. I went into the middle of the puddle there and it's behaving a little bit better now. But and then I'll take some of this paint and use it to define the back edge of some of these feathers. And this is a place also where if you had an area that you maybe got too much white or a blob in there that you don't really want, I don't really have a place like that on mine. I'm quite content with the way everything looks. But if you wanted to retouch something, you'd come in here and, just do a little retouching. Um, Wherever you go, it's going to make a little bit darker. It's going to make it a little bit darker, but it also adds, see in this area, it adds more um, values. Like it increases the light and dark values on your carving. So depending on where you are, and you don't have to sort of paint every feather dark. You can just do little select areas. I haven't done a huge area here, but what I have done is kind of created almost like a little row here. And you see how that just continues to add more. Values, just more values to everything. And this will make the piece look softer, more visually appealing. So to kind of recap on this, I've done some work on the tail. And if you've got an area that the tail is still looking a little too light, you come in here and touch it up. So, do some work on the tail, primaries, tertials, coverts, some of the softer body contour feathers. And you can see what a difference that makes in just looking at these feathers. We're going to be tying a few things with a wash in here a little bit later, but that's kind of what we're after. And you can, anywhere, like anywhere you look at your reference material, if you see any areas that are a little bit darker that you want to define some feathers a little bit, like, define some feather bases and, put something a little darker in there for the base of a feather. A few little fine marks. I'll just show you what that would look like if I'm putting a few little fine dark marks in. So you can spend many, many hours painting something with some of these little tiny fine marks. And so See, that makes just adds a little bit more visual interest. Now, if I look at this when I get this done, I've got a feeling that when I get this side part done on my little owl here, I'm probably going to want to just throw a little bit of a wash over everything to unify it together and then retouch some of my white marks. A lot of people end up wanting to get the painting done quick. And, if you want to be efficient with your painting, but I've found that there's absolutely no substitute for uh, building up your paint in layers. These ones are a little bit, these little black marks that I put in the front here are a little bit too harsh. And here's the other deal. Okay, they're a little too harsh. I'm not thrilled with them the way they are in there. I think they're just looking a little too dark, too stark, too harsh. But what I want to do is I want to kind of replicate that on the other side here, uh, because I'm going to be doing a correction with a wash. And there's no point just correcting one little portion of the bird. You may as well take a section or an area of the bird that you're going to be doing some correcting on. So even though I'm not that crazy about this up in here, I'm going to just do something that isn't, it's fairly similar over right across on the other side here. What this basically was is that I had probably just a little too much paint in my brush when I touched those things down. So you can see it does look, adds more depth. Okay, so leave it at that. I'll let that dry. I'll show you how I correct that later. So using the same paint, I've actually cleaned my brush after a certain amount of time when you're painting. Your paint gets a little thicker. It thickens up in the brush. The brush doesn't perform as well. Honestly, after 10 or 15 minutes of painting, it's not a bad idea just to get the brush soap out and clean your brush. And then I'm dabbing the brush down so the brush actually has a little better performance now. What I need to do is there's a few things that I need to get accomplished here. One is that I want to do some more detail work around the facial disc. And, you see there's darker values down on the outer edge of the facial disc, dark and light. Right now, I don't have a lot of those in there. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take this dark color and I'm just going to paint some lines. Again, I've diluted my paint a little bit more, but I'm just going to mostly going down the middle of these white streaks that I put in. I'm just going to paint some finer lines. I'm crisscrossing those lines. And as we dry out your brush fairly well so that you don't have a huge amount of paint in your brush. Start with a little line down the middle and then crisscross some of these lines. I'm mostly painting at the outer edge here. I'll bring a few of the lines in, to the middle a little bit. And it doesn't really matter if you get a few little fine lines over top of the white stuff that you've already done. You see how that it's just darkening up the back edge compared to what we started with. It's starting to add a little bit more depth and darkness to it. It doesn't matter if we end up too dark at this point. I do want to make sure that, like, if you look in here, there's some pretty dark values in the background in some of those corners. So I want to make sure I hit those values and maybe even a little darker in those corners. So again, it doesn't take that much, and I can bring some of these lines down, very fine little lines down into the face of the eye a little bit, like in a little closer to the eye here. You'll also notice that they're fairly dark around the perimeter of the eye. And because of that, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start painting these little fine lines. And if I do it as a series of fine lines in the around the eye like this, what I end up with is I end up with a bit of a blended kind of a look. It's not like if I just painted it, painted it dark. I'm making it look dark by creating a whole bunch of little streaky lines. And I can do the same thing, just looking at my photographs, do the same thing with these little streaky lines coming out from the middle of the eye. So this is a blacker value of burnt umber than what I started with. Like the first burnt umber right here was just straight burnt umber. And now I've added a little bit of black to it. And I want this to be darker when I'm down close to the eye. And gradually not as dark, when I get a little further up from the eye. It's still pretty dark. Like, again, if you look at your photographs there, you're trying to kind of replicate what you see. But I found in doing things like these owls, I found that having the brush at the right consistency and then starting in the lower part here and painting fine lines, fine little streaks, starts to get that looking uh, more like what you see in the photographs. What's that?
Starting with the eye.
Starting at the eye and pulling away from the eye, like kind of like a ray, and noticing that on the photograph, this little black band goes right around the eye. There's a tiny little bit all the way around. So I don't want the eye to be white at any point. Like I can paint right around the perimeter of the eye. I can always scrape that paint off later. It's a fairly dense, and it's actually more of a black. So I'm just getting this started. I'm laying it in with my dark umber. And what I'll do later is I'll come back with some actual carbon black and just do a little more touch up in there. Um, in looking at what I've got here, you see some more, like you really have to kind of look and see where where your lights and darks are in the photograph. And I paint that in. I'm looking overall on this. If you take like just the outside edge of the eye, look at that outside edge of the eye. This darkness, a whitish area along inside, just between the bill and the facial disc. There's quite a light area in there. But up on the other side here, this whole facial disc is fairly dark on the outer side, just a little bit on the outside of that eye. So you want to make sure that you're kind of capturing that you get that overall dark look on the outer. Like try to think of it as what would it look like if you're really blurry? Like if you need glasses and you don't have your glasses and you're looking at it, it's really, really blurry. What would that color look like? What would that density look like? And that's kind of what I think of a lot of times. I just try to think the bigger picture, the broader stroke. It looks dark from here out, where we hadn't quite got that on the other side. We started it, but now we're refining it, and is trying to add darkness where we see darkness, and I'm just kind of holding it against my photograph there, and you can see how it's getting darker on the outside. So you kind of do that on both sides. While I've got this in here, while I've got this paint in my brush and the detail, I'm actually going to take and I'm going to paint the bill with this dark brown. You could just go along and paint the bill black, mix up some black and paint the bill black. I'm going to paint this dark brown right now. And then I can come back and touch it up and paint it black later if I want. Like I'll leave it up to you, but quite often, just to get the look and feel of the piece, I will take the areas that are ultimately going to be black and I'll paint them with a dark brown. So you can do that with the bill. That just changes so much when you put that dark on the bill. And you can do the same thing with the toenails while you're at it, because they're quite dark. They're almost black. And I'm just going to paint one of them. I'm not going to do the whole foot just because of time here. I'll probably complete a lot of these things in a separate video. I'll do a lot more demonstration in a separate video on like the complete part of this painting. But just to give you an idea how how they look, you would paint all the nails like that. And so you see where that's like with the facial disc here, with the bill, um, and then some of these other little, like when you look close at the facial disc on these guys, they do have some very fine black lines coming up. Right, just looking, it's hard to see on some of these photographs, but you can see the lines come right out to the edge of the facial disc. So what I want to do is I just want to do a few of those. And if your brush doesn't have a huge amount of paint in it, that's better, because you don't want these lines looking too dark. Again, if they don't look quite right, like this one's a little dark, I can come with some white over it and then, just soften it up a little bit. But all of these, once you get your brush to a certain paint consistency, you can probably use some pretty fine lines with it. So, play around with it, get it to that right consistency. And when it's there, use it to paint some of these lines right out onto the nostril of the bird. It changes the look quite a bit when you can get some of these dark lines out. It's just kind of that back and forth. You'll, you can, what you'll do now basically is you'll take burnt umber, like regular burnt umber. You take this dark burnt umber and warm white, and you just kind of keep going back and forth with touching up, you know, touching things up, retouching them, darkening, lightening. I was going to demonstrate, or I am going to demonstrate just so you can see how that works. When you want to you want to bring a value down, you say, if this is looking darker than you want, like on the wings and the wingtips, I want to bring those. It's a little dark for me. Like I look at the bird, and this is a little intense for what I see when I'm looking at a live bird. It's interesting because on the camera, it doesn't look all that dark just because of the way the lighting is. When I hold it in front of me just and look at it, not on the camera, it looks a little dark to me, and it doesn't look dark on the camera. So um, it actually looks pretty good on the camera, but um, it is a little dark for my liking. So what I'll do is I'll take some of my warm white. I'm just going to leave this brush on the palette for the minute because I'll be using it shortly. Take some of my warm white. I'm going to mix up a wash again. Where did my syringe go? Did somebody? Oh, I've got it here. I'm going to add a whole bunch of water to um, this warm white wash and make a kind of a real skim milk or even thinner kind of wash out of this white. Load up my brush. So there's this paint is quite thin. I'm going to load up my brush. I'm going to dab out the brush on a paper towel so that the brush is almost dry. Like I've dabbed it out 5 or 6 times and the brush looks almost dry here when you look at it. And then I can take that brush and just go over the area that I want to lighten. Uh, Little trick there. Don't rub it too much. Just, get the paint on there, let it dry. It will go more transparent as it dries. I'm just gonna lighten up this area. I haven't done the detail on this side, but I'm still gonna use my fairly dry brush to lighten up the value of it a little bit. So anywhere that you want to lighten up the value on something, this is what you would do is you would take a wash of white, dry out your brush so it's quite dry, and then go over it like that, and you'll see it's lightened it up considerably. Um, if it ends up being too light, I can still see all of my margins, like my dark edges and my margins through here. If it ends up being too light, then again, very thin wash of burnt umber, dry brush that in. You're back and forth with these, but you're using them. The trick is a lot of water, really thin wash, dry brushing things in. And even with like the facial disc here, if I want to soften that up a little bit, I just take my dry brush and I start kind of going over parts of the facial disc. And my brush is almost completely dry. It doesn't leave a whole lot of paint on the bird, but look at the difference that makes. Just, the color and density here is a little closer to what I actually see on the photograph. And so this is how I adjust things, is very little paint in the brush. Even in here, I'll go over the area that I did, soften it up a little bit. And it wouldn't even be harmful. Like while I got this nice and soft like this, I'm going to pick up a little more paint, dry out my brush so that it's almost dry, and then kind of go over. I've got a little more paint coming out of it than I want still. over parts of the back, just with a light touch, light pass. This is what I talk about when I'm talking about doing different layers. When I'm working on something like this at home, I'll deliberately just go over the whole thing with these light passes of, in this case, of white. This will really soften up those little dark marks that I had up at the front of the head here that I wanted to get rid of. It'll blend them in and soften them up quite a bit. And then I would just come back with regular burnt umber and retouch some of the edges of these feathers. So it's a combination of like regular burnt umber, dark burnt umber, and white is pretty much the bulk of what you're going to be doing here. See, my brush is almost dry, but as I go over this, you see it does impart a little bit of dustiness to the look of that. And this is only really picking up the high spots. Like it's when you dry brush something on, you're only painting the mountaintops. When you wash something on, you're painting mostly the valleys, like if it's a wet wash and let it soak in. And at the very end of this whole thing, this will be something that comes up in the final video. At the very end of this whole thing, when I'm satisfied with the way everything looks and I've got my various values and the detail that I want in here, when I've got all that done, then I will usually flow a unifying wash I know you guys have been in classes with me before. You would have seen this. It just makes up like a dishwater wash of burnt umber, something really, really thin. I just flow that whole thing over the bird, and it gets down into the valleys with a subtle little darkening of the little detail in the low spots. And usually that's one of the last things you have to do. But so seeing how much softer this is looking after just dry brushing a little bit of white on there. And then I would come back here with this because that's actually looking a little closer to what I see on the back. It's a lighter value. I'll come in with some regular burnt umber and just darken up some of these feather tips like I did with a dark burnt umber. And it's that to get the real killer paint job on these things, it's that back and forth. And you'd even take your burnt umber and you'd with a wash thin burnt umber, you might want to enhance some of these little bars on the front. Although they're looking pretty good right now, just the way they are. They're fairly distinct. But I will be doing video on the, kind of the very, very final bit of painting, but I'm using the same approach, back and forth, dry brush a wash, lighten, darken, and I'm just using the three basic colors, umber, burnt umber, dark burnt umber, like with a little bit of black, and warm white. You can, if you really want to punch up, enhance some of these things later on as like a semi-final thing, take titanium white and just use it very sparingly in a few areas. That'll make things a lot brighter too. So I'll leave that at that. Got a little bit of time left. This is a bit of a experiment. I turned off my bright overhead light that I work under. And this actually looks a little bit more like on camera, it looks a little more accurate to what I'm seeing when I'm working with it. It's I've used that white wash over here and it looks a little milky, which is kind of not a problem. It's what I want at this point. It's a work in progress, but you can see the transparency that's happening in these feathers on the back. The false eye on the back here, these marks on the top of the head. And I did soften up in here. I used a little bit of a white dry brush wash in here to soften things up. I think I'll do a little bit more. And actually I might take a white, like a umber wash and dry brush some of that in here just to overwrite some of these dark marks that I got in here. I got a few dark dots in there that I'm still not real thrilled with. So I'll take some burnt umber and I'll dry brush some burnt umber into there, and then I can retouch these white marks on the head And I will show you how to do that in the final video. But it's hard for me to paint on camera. It's going to be hard for me to paint in this light so you can see what I'm doing. Like take a fine brush and start painting the edges of these feathers. It's hard for me to see it right now. I need more light. So, I turn on my bright overhead light. That changes the way it looks. You can see the detail a lot better, but it doesn't look quite the way we see it if we hold it off from the bright light. So thanks for pointing that out. So we're still, in the class time here. I've just mixed up a fairly thin wash of burnt umber. And now what I'm going to do with this burnt umber is I'm actually going to use it to go along the edges of these feathers that I'd done earlier. I can still very easily see where the edge was from the dark umber that I put on there. Yeah, just a small amount. Like this is quite a thin wash. There's not not a lot of pigment in this brush, but the goal and the hope is that when I get done this step, it actually looks better than it did the first time around. Like this looks softer and more, um, kind of more accurate. And I think it does look softer. It looks a little more like what you see on the,
Yeah, see that.
yeah, this one is a little off to the side here. Is a little high. I'll just lift that up. A little more like the tones that you see on the photograph here. Like it's getting a little closer. It's got that feel. It doesn't look and feel too dark. Um, and that's it's interesting because when you first put that milky, warm white wash on here, your first reaction might be, oh, did I wreck it? Um, it's because it doesn't look right after you do that. It looked better before, and then you put the wash on, and it's like, oh, it doesn't look as good now as it did before. But then when you come back and hit it with a little bit of this burnt umber on the edge, you're just doing an adjustment, and I think it actually looks a lot better now than it did.
If you were doing a split, not a splayed or something, you could paint that.
Yeah, you'd have to paint all your little splits in there. Like you'd painted, dark edge. And I don't think I did any splits on this particular guy. But yeah, if you're doing a split, this is where you'd paint that split in. Um, and if you're doing a bird that's a little smoother, you can actually um, paint those splits in wherever you want. That's one of the advantages of doing smoother texture is you got a lot more control over unique features and things like that on the piece. So I'm quite pleased with the way that's starting to look. You get an idea how that adjustment can make such a significant change. And now all I'm using is just regular plain old burnt umber that's been diluted into a kind of a lighter wash. And then I keep on going on that area. That all works. I can use this plain burnt umber here to just kind of enhance some of the edges of the facial disc, because I had used that um, dry brushing the whitewash over top of that. And I don't have much paint in my brush, but I've got enough that it changes the look of everything here. Just kind of brightens it up a little bit. Big thing is don't be afraid to kind of play around and experiment with this stuff.
Seems like you just use those two brushes for those.
Yeah, that's pretty much the entire piece. I don't know that I need anything else for brushes. This one does, I can do some pretty nice fine lines with it when I get the paint to the right consistency. And I love these filberts or cat's tongues, because sideways I got good control, and you can use them for, broader things like this to lay things in. Now, at home, I've got 2 or 3 different sizes of cat's tongues. Like I've got I think a 6, an 8, and a 10. And, I use them for depending on the size of the bird and what I'm doing. But, I really, really like them. A good quality sable cat's tongue like this can really make painting a pleasure. So, and then here's something else. So when I look at this, I see these little dark areas, like a little bit of a dark beard, if you will, almost below the bill. And I haven't got that indicated in here. So again, the way I do that is dry out my brush and just make some streaks. I don't want to just paint a stripe in there. I want to just create it so that this area down the middle here is darker. So if I do it with little strokes like that, see, it's starting to darken that up. And then I'll be able to come in with some white later on and just, paint some white. And that's the kind of stuff you do. You look at something like this, and you look in here at some of these guys, and you can, you can determine if there's an area that you want to make it look a little darker. Then this is where you take this burnt umber wash and you put it on a little bit at a time in layers. And my brush doesn't have a lot of paint in it, but if I go over the same area 2 or 3 times, see, it's making it look darker. And I'm trying to kind of replicate what I see there. This is actually kind of neat because the Joe Sonia burnt umber, the pigment itself is pretty darn close to what I saw in the live birds. Like, it doesn't need a lot of adjustment. If some birds you need it to be more red, you could add some burnt sienna to it to make it a little redder. If you need a more neutral brown, you can add a little bit of ultra blue to it, like ultramarine blue, and that'll kind of make it a little more neutral. So in here, that stuff in the middle of this area below the bill, it's dried. So I'm just adding a little bit to the center of it, darkening up the center, and I'm just going to add a little bit, touch up just the tips of some of these little teeny feathers that I put in here. And kind of getting the idea, just little bit by little bit, you keep on refining and adjusting what you see. If I want this to be a little less stark, like I see these bases of these are maybe a little lighter than I'd like them to be. So I just come in with some of this burnt umber, and I can darken up some of these bases, just so straight burnt umber. It's diluted enough that I'm not just painting a dark brown mark on it. I haven't gotten rid of that nice dark edges on these feathers. So you just tone it down a little bit. Again, I'm just going to turn off that overhead light a little bit so you can get a better sense on camera once it's had a chance to adjust, hopefully. Um, maybe not. Focus here. Come on, focus. There we go. So you get a better sense of how that, now that looks a little bit more what it looks like. It's outside of that bright light. An idea what the throat on this area around here is looking a little softer. Move that around. So that'll be that's just something you keep on practicing at, back and forth, back and forth. I've probably got a couple of hours worth of video painting to do, like to show you the back and forth and how that works. And I do want to take it to a more advanced level. Like that's one of the reasons why, like, I'd like to do a couple more hours of video painting to help you see how adding another layer, putting a wash on there and adding another layer, and then that back and forth, and how that ends up making the thing look so much softer. In a class like this, typically what we've done is the most basic paint job we can. And, you know, it's always nice if you can add, like you're mentioning, you'd like to redo your bluebird. And yeah, now that you kind of understand that if you add more layers onto the bluebird, you'll just make it look that much softer, that much more realistic. So that's it for the, kind of the formal part of the class. You got most of the way there. And as I mentioned earlier, I haven't demonstrated this in class, but I had taken the little X-Acto knife and does somebody have one of those knives here? I just hand that over. I'll do a little demonstration here quickly. So I've just a regular little X-Acto knife. The one thing that I want to make sure of is that's not good. See what happened there? Ripped on him. So what I'm going to do is I'm just dab him off on my towel. Just quick little, not rub, quick little, because it's a wash. Quick little dab him off on the towel. And I think actually that's why the paint sticks are so nice. I think I got most of the stuff off there. So yeah, there's another little wash layer there to add to.
Recommend technique.
Yeah, that's why you end up using your paint stick to put it into the holder there. I didn't think he'd roll off like he did, but leave him there off to the side.
Flat spots.
Yeah, just lay him on the flat spot. Let me get this tray out of here. There we go. And so now you want to make sure what I was doing is I was just making sure that that the knife was clean. If depending on what you've been using the knife for, if the knife has anything abrasive on it, like from sandpaper or anything like that, you want to be careful because that could actually scratch your eye. But all I'm doing is I just very light pressure, just to give you an idea how this works. Very light pressure. This is an X-Acto knife. I know a lot of people are afraid to do this, and I've seen things and read things. Like I know it was an article in Wildfall Carving magazine where the person who wrote the article said you should never, ever, 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 touch a glass eye with a knife. And I have yet to see, using a clean, sharp blade like this, I've yet to see anybody scratch a glass eye with that knife. Yeah, and I just use light pressure and go over it, a number of times. Just kind of scrape, and I use a little point of this to get right down into the edge of the little edge of the eye. And I'm not just using the point of this. I'm kind of laying it down as flat as I can on the eye. I mean, it's a straight blade and a curved eye, so you don't get a lot of surface area contact. You have to kind of go over it a number of times, but um, eventually, if you just take your time. Now, the options for this, some people will buy, like watercolor artists use a product called masking fluid. It's a paint on liquid. And when I'm working with, like when I do eyes for the World Championships or something for my pieces, I use eyes that I've made out of acrylic, and definitely don't want to try doing this with an acrylic eye. You'll destroy it. So what I do is I use masking fluid, and before I paint the bird, before I even seal it, I'll paint a layer of masking fluid over top of the eye, usually 2 layers of masking fluid just to be on the safe side. You know what the masking fluid is? It's basically almost like a little bit of a rubber cement kind of stuff. Um, it kind of sticks to the eye, but not really, really intently. And I just put a couple layers of masking fluid over the eye, and then paint everything as I do. And then when I'm all done, I just peel the masking fluid off the eye. I mean, this masking fluid is kind of neat because it's intended to be used on watercolor paper. So you can mask off an area when you're doing watercolor work. You can mask off an area with masking fluid. And then when you're all done, you just lift it off the watercolor paper, and it doesn't adhere to the watercolor paper. Like, it doesn't lift off the paper. So it's definitely not going to stick to. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah, I say a couple of months. If you leave it on for a couple of days, it's usually not a problem, or a week or something. But with a glass eye, it's not a problem. Leave it on for 2 months. Nobody's gonna, because there's nothing, it's not porous, there's nothing. So, I've got the one eye cleaned off. I'll do the other one off camera, but it makes such a huge difference once you get those eyes. And yeah, there's something else that I just want to mention on we had a customer from Ontario that he's carving a Saw Whet Owl. Nothing to do with this class at all. Like, he's an older fellow that doesn't even have a computer. So he just phones and talks to us. But he was carving a Saw Whet Owl, and we sent him a pair of Saw Whet Owl eyes. And he wanted the eyes to look more like this, like, the big, big pupils. If you see, I've seen Saw Whet Owl pictures where the pupils are smaller, like when they're in daylight. And I kind of like this look myself. That's just a personal preference. But we do produce eyes with a large owl pupil. So if somebody wanted to make sure the owls look more like this, just a little yellow band around a bigger pupil, we can produce these eyes with a pupil that's looks more like these photographs. I just wanted to make sure I mentioned that too. This is something that's deliberate. When I did my first little miniature Saw Whet, I've got to find it somewhere. We've got it in storage, but it's a half-size Saw Whet Owl, little guy. And I didn't, we didn't have quite as much control over eyes back then. This is back in the early 90s, I think, might have been when I did that little Saw Whet. And the eyes that I used were a really, really expensive Tohican eye. And they're an aspheric eye, like concave convex, very, very high quality, really amazing looking eye. But the problem with them is they had a really small pupil, and they just, it just doesn't look right in and out. Like, to this day, I'm thinking I wouldn't mind just tearing the eyes out of that Saw Whet that I did. And in fact, yeah, I think I gave you guys notes on the Saw Whet, right? Like, you got some printed notes. There's a photograph on the back page of that little miniature Saw Whet. And you can see one of the first things I notice when I look at it is, oh, those pupils are small. It just doesn't look right. So what's that? Yeah, but even in the daylight, these guys have pretty big pupils. Like, even in daylight. But so if you're, scraping the paint off your eyes, just don't be in a hurry when you're doing it. It'll be fine. So there's the bulk of it is off of there now. Clean that up a little bit more for the Facebook photographs for later today, but kind of gives you an idea now. I'm going to turn off this light again, just once it's adjusted. It actually changes quite a bit, doesn't it? Turn off that bright light. The bright light's great for working under, and it doesn't look quite as stark when I'm looking at it in person, but the way the video camera picks it up, it looks a lot nicer. Actually, kind of in between the two. This is showing some of the flaws more, I think, than it doesn't give you the subtleties. And when I turn on the light, it doesn't quite look right either. So
Centers of the bar. What colors are those?
if you're looking at the barbs themselves, you look at the photograph, there doesn't appear to be a whole lot of difference in color on the feather barb. You're talking about the shaft.
The shaft.
Yeah, the shaft itself. They seem to be pretty close in color to the rest of the plumage. And one thing that I do, and I'll show this in the final video, is I like most of the time, if you look at the structure feathers, the flight feathers, tail feathers, wing feathers on a bird where the shaft is quite pronounced, I'll actually take some gloss varnish and paint a little thin stripe of gloss varnish on the top of each of those shafts, just to give them a bit more of a sheen. And I see that on most live healthy birds. You can usually see a tiny bit of a sheen on the feather shafts. I'd have to dig through and look at these photographs, a little closer to see if I've got any of that dynamic happening. I think, even on the tail feathers here, hard to see whether there's any shininess to these shafts or not. Okay.